With me is Tony Benn. Welcome to Going Underground, Tony. Very early in the book, the royal prerogative, still existing in 2013. Why is it so important to you, the power of the royal prerogative over the House of Commons?
Well, because we claim to live in a democracy. We elect a parliament and the parliament makes the laws, but we still are subjects of a king or queen, almost as if we were in medieval times, and the Queen has enormous powers which she can use. She appoints the Archbishop of Canterbury, appoints prime ministers, calls parliaments, agrees to laws, none of which she really does, but the theoretical power of the prerogative is something you have to take into account if you consider constitutional change.
And it's still so important, even though it's big business, arguably, that holds power over the House of Commons.
Well, big business holds a different sort of power, that the global economy can dictate what governments do. But this is a particularly British characteristic, which I've been interested in because so many of the things that interest me do depend upon the royal prerogative being used.
And you didn't make it to become one of the elders, I notice. Tell me a little bit about the elders and how it even relates to nuclear weapons, theoretically, in Britain.
Well, I don't know who thought the idea up, whether it was Richard Branson, the industrialist, or whether it was on the Russian side. The idea that you should gather together senior people who've held high office in different governments, bring them together as a sort of international think tank. And I was invited to go to one as an advisor, and so I went. And then I met them, and Archbishop Tutu was there, and it was a very interesting gathering of senior people. But then I became a bit suspicious of it. What was it really about? Was it an attempt by big business to manipulate senior political people for their own interests? But the idea of using older politicians for international agreement, I think, is quite an interesting one.
You also talk about power of the intelligence services. I noticed you mentioned the intelligence services. You were in the intelligence research department, and you're saying something about Airey Neave, the murdered MP. It was fascinating to read it. So there are some theories that the intelligence services in Britain can carry out, or at least you heard, assassination attempts.
Well, that was a strange example, but the Airey Neave was a spy. He really worked for the intelligence services, and he once said something, I forget where, that if I ever became Prime Minister I should be assassinated or something. And so I noted that, and that would have been done, of course, under the royal prerogative. And so it was just an interesting example. I don't say it was very serious, but it was just an interesting example of a loose comment by a senior person that gave you an idea of what might be going on behind the scenes.
You're a supporter of WikiLeaks. Why do you continue to support WikiLeaks when the Intelligence Committee, for instance, at the House of Commons says it's so dangerous, or members of it do? The
thing about WikiLeaks is they bring out information which is in the public interest, but is not in the interest of the government. For example, all governments do all sorts of funny things in the intelligence, and if everybody knew what they were doing, there would be a much greater control over them, because they wouldn't be able to get away with what they want. So I've always supported the idea of freedom of information and open information, and WikiLeaks have a part to play in that. And they still frighten big governments, because governments don't want everyone to know what they're doing.
And when it comes to intelligence, you famously, intelligence and Iraq were very linked. What do you think should happen to Tony Blair now, so many years after the war?
Well, what he did was to commit a war crime. There's no question about that. That was a war crime. I think what happened was he gave a private assurance to Bush that if Bush wanted to attack Iraq, he would support him. And I think that may have influenced Bush to go to war because he thought at least I'll have Britain on my side. And if it was a war crime, then clearly he could be sent to the Hague.
What do you want to happen?
Well, I think it's important that we apply the laws to ourselves that we think should be applied to others, and we just have to see what happened. But there's been a long delay in producing the report on the Iraq War, and when that comes out, we shall be in a better position to judge how...
Do you think any of us will be alive when the Chilcot report comes out? I mean, they said it would come out last year.
I know, I think it will have to come out, and I think anyway the facts are so well known that even if Chilcot doesn't come out, people know quite well what really happened.
Do you think the Labour Party has changed since that experience of the Blair years?
Yes, I do. I think that Blair was developed a sort of minor group of Thatcherism. He agreed with Mrs. Thatcher and thought that she was right, but she should be made more acceptable. And New Labour was a Conservative party being reborn inside the Labour Party. And now I think the Labour Party has set that all aside and has adopted a new leader who is a regular Labour man. And Blair is just a part of our history. Every country have people in the past they don't like to think about. I dare say that's true in Russia too.
You've often talked about the dangers of austerity and what political movements arise out of austerity. How do you think the Labour Party is looking at that? Because they do talk about immigration. Ed Miliband talked about immigration. Do you think Ed Miliband will use the immigration card electorally?
Well, the argument about immigration is a difficult one because we have had many immigrants. Indeed, our public services depend upon people from Africa and the Middle East who run them. When I've been in hospital, I've had Indian nurses and African doctors and people looking after me. So you have to be very careful about it. And it is true that when there is unemployment, the public are nervous. They may lose their jobs and they be taken by low-paid immigrants. So you have to be sensitive to that.
Is Ed Miliband being sensitive?
Well,
he spoke in Munich.
Well, he certainly refers to it. And you have to be very careful how you handle it, because if you mishandle the immigration thing, you can stimulate hostility to foreigners, and that is a very dangerous thing to do. On the other hand, you have also to be sensitive to the fact there are people in Britain who are nervous of what might happen to them if a lot of immigrants come in. So it's a balance of common sense.
The Labour Party under Brown and Blair were keen on privatisation, arguably. They prepared the post office for privatisation. How do you think privatisation policies will continue in the current two-party, three-party model?
Well, I don't think that privatisation would continue under a Labour government. I mean, for example, the post office is being privatised, and I think a Labour government would try to stop that if we had the time to do so. And I can't see any other examples of privatisation that would recommend themselves to a Labour government.
But it was Peter Mandelson who was preparing the post office for privatisation.
Well, he was, yes, he was, but that was the Blair, under the Blair period. But nowadays, I don't think people really think that makes a lot of sense. But the Labour Party is a coalition, and it has a left and a right in it, and it argues within itself as to what it should do, which is a normal democratic process.
How far do you think British politicians realise differences in foreign policy, who to get close to, as it were, the United States or China? Because I know you believe that China is going to become rapidly the superpower of this century.
How far does... What was the question again?
Britain's relationship vis-à-vis America on the one side and China on the other. Some Labour politicians very keen on getting closer to Washington, ever closer.
Yes.
Others looking to the developing world and to the emerging countries.
Well, I'm in favour of us having the most open foreign policy you can have, I think, to try to plan your foreign policy without regard to what Russia thinks, to what India thinks, to what China thinks, would be foolish, because we all live in this small globe and we have to make sense of it. So that I'm not in favour of just becoming an American colony. I think we have to be much more open to the world and its influences than that.
While austerity could help progressive politics, of course it could help the far right and fascism in Britain. How do you see it going at the moment?
I don't think there's any very strong, hard right position. But I mean, you know from experience that if a country feels threatened by anything, whether it be by austerity or by some foreign enemy, then it tends to react in a nationalistic way, which is a right-wing way, whereas what people want when things get difficult is for the policies to be re-examined to see how you can make a better argument for dealing with these problems. And that's the argument between austerity and confidence. And the left should be a part of the confidence movement and not be tempted into right-wing solutions.
And viewing it right now, what do you think? Who's winning this battle of ideas?
Well, I think that Miliband, the Labour leader, is a very constructive man, and I think he's looking forward in that way. And there's a lot of grounds for belief that we can win that argument because there's a lot of opposition to the cuts. A lot of people talking about improved public services and so on. And I think you have to retain confidence, but, you know, I'm not in the business of forecasting the future, and I recognise things can go wrong, but I don't believe they will go wrong.
And on Ed Miliband, what would you say to people who complain that they're the same Blair Brown people that are within the circle of Ed Miliband?
Well, Ed Miliband was voted for against a right-wing Blairite. His own brother David is a very strong Blairite, and I think the fact that he was elected was very significant. I think his links with the trade unions are very important. His vision about how things could be organised are very useful, and I think he's somebody in whom we have confidence. But of course, with the election coming and you don't know what the outcome will be, it's difficult to forecast. But I have a lot of confidence in Ed Miliband. I think he will do a very good job.
Because there seems to be some people saying, don't vote. There's no point in voting anymore. You yourself in the book talk about the goodwill, too much goodwill in the House of Commons. It's a club. That view is spreading in the time of austerity, so people are saying, especially young people, why should they vote?
Well, I think the right wing are trying to encourage people to lose confidence in voting. They say to people they're all the same and so on. And they're trying to spread pessimism. And pessimism is an instrument of the right, because if you can persuade people to be pessimistic, they won't make the effort, they won't try. And if people don't try, you'll never succeed. So you have to treat pessimism not as an objective truth, but as a deliberate policy designed to discourage people from exercising their rights to decide how we're governed.
On the subject of hope, it's noticeable that all the work for Stop the War Coalition, they take some of the credit. They're saying there was no war on Syria, big war on Syria, because of a parliamentary vote. It was David Cameron who, of course, said because of that vote, the sovereignty of Parliament must be respected. Do you think there are reasons for hope, certainly as regards foreign aggression by Britain?
Well, I think most people in Britain want peace. We've suffered a lot from war. And I think when wars begin, more and more people are saying, why has that occurred? Whose interest is it we should do this war? Whose interest is it not in it? Who should doubt it? And I think internationalism in the public mind is becoming quite a major factor. For example, the reaction in Britain to the victory of Nelson Mandela is a very interesting example. People felt that it was not in our interests that the whites should win that battle in South Africa, and therefore they backed Mandela even when he was in prison. They supported him, and in the end they woke up and said, well, we were right. That campaign has succeeded and we were right to support it.
But nowadays it's conservative politicians that are more against the foreign wars than Labour people.
Well, the Conservatives have an isolationist element, which is rather different. We don't want to have anything to do with the world. My view is that we must have an interest in the world, but it should be a positive interest, and try to identify what is in the interest of the people you're dealing with, not just a nationalist interest ourselves.
And as for hope domestically here in Britain, the austerity cuts are ravaging the country, life expectancy figures are going down in areas. What reasons do we have to be hopeful for in a time of austerity in Britain at the moment?
Well, I think hostility to what is happening is very strong. I think if you talk to people, most people are very, very angry about the cuts. And if you come along and say, well, this is what we're going to do, and if you vote for us, this is what we will do, then I think you do get quite a warm response. But you have to be careful about pessimism, because pessimism is deliberately designed to take away hope from people. And if you take away hope from people, then nothing will ever change.
All your political career, you've been monitoring the media. I know you're at the National Union of Journalists. You're, of course, also Stop the War Coalition's president. Countless marches against war. What do you think the media has got worse? I mean, you're very critical now of the BBC and ITV.
Well, the media the private media represent the views of those who own the newspapers. Rupert Murdoch owns the Times and the Sun, and the Daily Mail is owned by another proprietor. And so you have to see the media as if they were political parties. They get mass coverage, they have their own policies, they present the news in a way that suits their own purpose.
Has it got worse?
Well, I think in some ways it has. The BBC has always aimed to stand apart from it all, but the BBC has never really presented a balanced account of what's being said in Britain, so that I have some doubts about the BBC, but I don't put them in the same category as the privately owned newspapers. The BBC is run by principled people who believe they're doing something independent, whereas the newspaper proprietors are just crudely using their power to get the public to support their policies, which is a different attitude.
Arguably, Britain has never, since the war certainly, had such austerity cuts as it's going through right now. What do you think will come out of those austerity cuts?
Well, the government argument is that out of the austerity cuts there will be a better balance in our economy. But of course the price that is paid for the austerity cuts is paid for by the poorest people. There is a mass problem of poverty in Britain. Costs are rising very rapidly, and even though wages are going up, they're not going up at the same speed as costs.
What is the political impact of these huge disparities, bigger than the 80s? Or?
It has created undoubtedly a much greater support for the Labour policy, which is to stop the cuts and go for expansion. The government claims that it's solving the problem and therefore hoping to win public support for that, but I'm not sure the government is right in supposing that they're winning support because of the cuts, because the cuts affect so many people. At any rate, that is a period of post-Thatcher period, which I think is coming to an end now.
But the argument goes that Labour isn't that different. There is a rising tide of apathy. There was apathy, of course, all through. Since the war, arguably, there's been apathy, but now people talk about lower voter turnouts. What do you think the dangers of apathy are in a time of austerity?
Well, I think that apathy is used as an argument to discourage people from trying to make change. Because if you say to people all the time, whatever you do, nothing will happen, all politicians are crooked, they're all out for themselves, what you're really doing is trying to obliterate the power of democracy. And therefore, we have to introduce an element of hope and say, well, it may seem difficult, but we can do it. And if you persuade people you can do it, then they'll put the effort in to do it. I mean, South Africa is a very good example. How did Mandela persuade the Africans as a whole to support his campaign against apartheid? Because they believed they could win, and they were right. And then the whites came round and accepted it. So it is a battle between confidence and apathy, and apathy is a weapon used by the right, and confidence is a weapon used by the left.
And finally, what's your next book?
Well, I haven't got round to thinking about that. I've had to stop the diaries because I had illness, but I still write a bit, and this last diary was really brought the diaries up to date, and also some reflections on being old. I'm on the way to being 90. And when you get to that age, you do see the world in a slightly different way. You see it in a greater historical perspective. And when I look back on my life, I remember the Spanish Civil War. I remember so many things. I remember the historic role that Russia played in defeating Hitler, the fantastic courage of Russian troops at a time when we were really up against it. And so I look to Russia as one of our greatest and most important allies, and I believe these memories are useful to have because they help you to shape your view of other countries and your view as to how you should work with them. And I'm a great believer in close relations between Britain and Russia.
Tony Benn, thank you.